He hadn't called in months. Then, out of the blue, my son invited me to dinner. Not just any dinner, but a reservation at the Mariner's Perch, the most expensive restaurant in our coastal Maine town, a place of hushed tones and heavy silverware I hadn't seen in decades. He even said he'd pick me up himself, a gesture so uncharacteristic it felt like a flag being raised in a windless sky. Leo was never one for surprises, and certainly not for demonstrative affection. So when he offered a warm smile and held the car door open for me that evening, a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze should have run down my spine, but it didn't. I let my guard down, seduced by a flicker of hope. That was my first mistake. The wind had already started to bite that week. Early November in Port Clyde always brought a sharpness to the air, a salty sting that promised the long, quiet winter was close. I had just finished securing the storm shutters on the seaside cottage, my knuckles raw from the cold, when the phone rang, its shrill sound an intrusion on the rhythm of the waves. I almost let it go unanswered. Most calls these days were either the pharmacy confirming a prescription or a well-meaning neighbor checking in. But this time, the caller ID showed Leo's name. He spoke softer than usual, his voice carefully casual, stripped of the usual impatience I'd grown accustomed to. He said he and Simone were in town for the weekend and thought it would be nice to treat me to a proper dinner, just the three of us. I paused, my hand tightening on the receiver. My son, the son who measured his visits in hours and his conversations in minutes, never just suggested things like that. He was always busy with his financial firm in Portland, always distracted by a ringing phone or a pressing email. And Simone, his wife, well, she wasn't unkind, but she was distant in a way that never quite melted. She wore her politeness like a perfectly tailored coat, stylish and impenetrable no matter how many holidays we shared. Still, something about the invitation made me say yes. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been settling in my bones lately, a damp chill like the sea fog that crept in on quiet mornings, blurring the line between the water and the sky. Or maybe it was that foolish, stubborn flicker of hope, the kind a mother never really grows out of, that maybe this time would be different, that maybe your child finally wants to see you not as a duty on a checklist, but as family. They picked me up just before sunset. Leo looked unfamiliar in a crisp wool coat, the collar turned up against the wind. Simone wore one of those camel-toned wrap jackets she always favored, an armor of quiet expense. The Mariner's Perch was all soft amber light and polished dark wood, overlooking the harbor where the fishing boats bobbed gently, their lights casting long, shimmering reflections on the dark water. I hadn't been anywhere this nice since before my husband Robert passed away. Leo held the car door for me. Simone took my coat with a smile that felt a degree warmer than usual. She even complimented my old cashmere scarf, a gift from Robert years ago. For a brief, fragile moment, I allowed myself to believe this was real, that perhaps something had shifted between us. Maybe they were beginning to see me again, the person I was before I became just Mom, a relic from a life they had long since outgrown. We were led to a corner table with a panoramic view of the harbor. A waiter, silent and efficient, brought a bottle of red wine. Leo poured my glass himself, a deep, rich crimson. I told him I was fine with just water, that wine tended to make me sleepy, but he insisted. "It's a celebration, Mom," he said, his smile not quite reaching the cool calculation in his eyes. I smiled back, lifting the heavy glass. But deep down, a quiet part of me, a primal instinct that had been dormant for years, suddenly became alert. I told myself it was just nerves, the awkwardness of being in a place so far removed from my quiet life. But in my bones, a low hum of warning had already begun. The wine was smooth, older than I expected, with a soft plum finish that lingered. Simone leaned in, her perfume a subtle, expensive scent of sandalwood, and something I couldn't name. She asked how I was sleeping these days, her head tilted just so, her voice a practiced melody of concern. I told her the truth, or part of it. That the nights were quiet, too quiet sometimes since Robert was gone. That the old house creaked and groaned in the wind like a lonely ship at sea. She nodded, her expression one of perfect sympathy. Leo listened, but mostly let her do the talking. He seemed intensely focused on the menu, asking the waiter about wine pairings, offering suggestions for appetizers. It was strange watching them together like this. They weren't openly affectionate, but there was a seamless rhythm to their partnership, the way their eyes would meet for a split second across the table, like dancers executing a move they had rehearsed 1,000 times. By the time the main course arrived, seared scallops for me, a steak for Leo, the mood had subtly shifted, the preliminary warmth had served its purpose, and the conversation began to gently steer toward a destination. Simone's tone became more cheerful, more animated. "I was just thinking on the drive over," she began, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "Have you been down to the cove lately, Clara?" "Not since late summer," I said, my appetite suddenly waning. "The path gets slippery this time of year." She nodded, a pleased, knowing look on her face. Then she turned to Leo, though her words were meant for me. "It would be such a lovely location for small events, can you imagine? Intimate weddings, corporate retreats, those wellness weekends that are so popular now." I didn't respond right away. I watched Leo meticulously cut his steak into slow, even bites. His hands didn't shake. Mine, resting in my lap, had started to tremble. Simone went on, her voice painting a vivid picture of what she envisioned. She spoke of natural lighting, of rustic chic renovations, of how the old cottage could be restored to its full potential. She mentioned her friend in Boston, a woman who ran a boutique hospitality firm, who had apparently seen photos and was incredibly enthusiastic. Then she turned that brilliant, polite smile back on me and said, "The land is such a gift, Clara. And gifts should be shared, don't you think?" I placed my fork down on the edge of my plate. The rich, buttery scent of the risotto suddenly felt cloying. Something inside me went quiet and cold. When dessert was served, a delicate crème brûlée for Simone and a chocolate lava cake for Leo, he finally made his move. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. The papers inside were neatly clipped, certain phrases highlighted in a pale yellow. He spoke plainly, his voice devoid of the earlier warmth, now all business. "We've talked to a few professionals," he said, avoiding my eyes as he slid the folder across the table. "Just to get some ideas. We think it's time to be proactive about the property." "If you sign now," Simone added, her spoon making a soft cracking sound as it broke the caramelized sugar of her dessert, "we could start the process before the new year. No pressure, of course. You could still live there. We wouldn't change a thing without asking. It's just a formality, some legal housekeeping." The light above our table was golden and soft, designed to make everything look beautiful, but everything inside me felt cold and stark. I looked down at the paper. My full name, Clara Annabelle Vance, was already typed in bold, and that's when I realized, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that I wasn't invited to dinner. I was summoned. I was the final item on their agenda. I sat back, letting the sweet scent of chocolate drift past me. The table had gone quiet, except for the faint clink of Simone's spoon. Leo's tone was even, almost soothing, as if he were offering me a warm blanket instead of a legal document that would strip me of my home. He began explaining the basics, calling it a simple deed transfer. "Just to tidy things up," he said. "Something smart to do before winter really sets in." His words were so carefully chosen, each one designed to sound harmless, responsible. He didn't look up from the folder as he spoke. Simone did. Her eyes, cool and steady, were fixed on me. I didn't touch the papers. My hands stayed folded in my lap, my knuckles white. He said that with the land in his name, they could manage the rising property taxes more efficiently. He used phrases like legacy planning and consolidating ownership. He assured me my name would still be on record, just not as the primary title holder. Simone nodded along, offering quiet affirmations. "It's for your own good, Clara. To take the burden off you." It was all perfectly, chillingly rehearsed. I finally found my voice. "What's the rush, Leo?" He chuckled, a short, dry sound. "There isn't one," he said. But the way he leaned forward, elbows on the table, told me otherwise. Simone chimed in again, her voice gentle but with an unmistakable edge. "We've spoken to a local planning consultant just in case. The town, she claims, is considering rezoning all the coastal properties for commercial use. It would be wise to act before anything changes, before our hands are tied." That word, act, lingered in the air between us. My own hand, feeling strangely detached, reached out and opened the folder. The top page had my full name and address typed out in bold. The next page listed the parcel number, the exact coordinates of the land Robert and I had walked 1,000 times, and a brief, brutally clear clause stating transfer of ownership in full. There was a highlighted line near the bottom. I could still reside on the property for the remainder of my natural life, but all development rights, all decisions regarding the land, would be under the sole control of Leo Robert Vance. There was a signature line waiting for me, just one. I closed the folder without reading further. My breath was steady, but my chest felt like it was encased in ice. "I'm not feeling well," I said, my voice a near whisper. Simone's expression didn't falter. She reached out and touched my wrist, her fingers cool. "Of course, Clara. We can do this another time. We've overwhelmed you." Leo smiled, but I saw the tightening in his jaw. His hand was still on the folder when I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The waiter returned with the bill, and Leo waved it away with a practiced gesture, already paid. He stood to help me with my coat, polite to the very end. As we stepped outside, the November wind cut through the air like a physical warning. In the car, no one spoke. The silence was thick with what hadn't been signed. Leo drove me home, his headlights slicing through patches of fog rolling in off the sea. When we reached my porch, he turned to me, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights. "You will think it over, won't you, Mom?" he asked, his voice almost too casual. I nodded, unable to form words. He leaned in and kissed my cheek. It felt cold. Simone remained in the passenger seat, a silent, silhouetted partner. Inside, I set the folder down on the kitchen table and stared at it under the harsh fluorescent light. It looked like an artifact from another life. The house was quiet, too quiet. I walked to the living room and sat in my armchair near the window. The cove, barely visible through the pines, shimmered faintly in the dark. That land had been in my family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather had built the cottage with his own hands. Robert used to say it held more memory than sand. I had always believed that. Now I wondered if my son had ever believed it at all. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless state. I kept hearing the echo of their voices, the smooth, reasonable tones overlaying the harsh reality of their request. The next morning I woke with a tight ache across my chest. The coffee tasted bitter, no matter how much sugar I stirred in. That dinner hadn't been about family. It had been a transaction. By noon, I bundled up and walked the familiar path down to the cove. Robert had built a small bench there, tucked into a curve of the rocks, sheltered from the wind. He used to sit there with his thermos and his binoculars, watching the seabirds. That spot was sacred. I sat down, the cold of the wood seeping through my coat, and let the weight in my chest settle. Robert's voice echoed in my memory. He had been so clear about the land. "This place stays in the family, Clara. Not for profit, not for projects, but for roots. It's our anchor." He had trusted me to carry that forward. I had always imagined one day passing it on to Leo when he was ready, when he understood its meaning, but last night had shown me he didn't want the soul of the land. He wanted its potential, its yield, its market value. When I came back inside, chilled to the bone, I walked past the hallway where we kept the family photos. I paused. Something was wrong. My eyes scanned the collection of mismatched frames. There was one missing, a small, simple silver frame that held a picture of me and Robert, taken years ago. We were kneeling on the sand, cataloging shells after a big storm, our faces weathered and genuinely happy. Leo had taken it on a spring morning, saying it was the most peaceful he'd ever seen us look. I searched the drawer where we kept spare frames. It wasn't there. I stared at the empty space on the wall, a pale rectangle against the faded wallpaper. It was a small thing, but it felt like a violation. That photo was gone, just like the part of me they no longer found useful. 2 days later, still reeling, I decided to drive to Leo's house in Portland. I told myself it was to drop off a box of old nautical charts he used to love as a boy, a peace offering of sorts. Simone opened the door, her smile tight. I stepped inside their perfectly decorated, minimalist home, a place that always felt more like a magazine spread than a house where people actually lived. And then I saw it. On the main hallway wall, a newly framed, massive family collage. Glossy, professional prints arranged in a perfect grid, a ski trip to Sugarloaf, a birthday party, a backyard barbecue. Everyone looked polished, posed, effortlessly happy. But I wasn't in any of them, not one. I walked right up to it, my fingers hovering over the cold glass. Leo stood in the center of most photos, arms slung around Simone or one of the kids. They looked happy, whole. My place in their life, in their visual history, was gone. Erased. Simone came up behind me, her voice light. "Oh, we just had those printed last week. A little holiday update." There was no apology in her tone, no acknowledgement of the glaring omission. I turned away and placed the box of charts on their entryway table. On the way out, I noticed a small gift pile near the fireplace. One box had a tag addressed to Grammy. A card sat on top, scribbled in crayon by my granddaughter. It said, "We miss you." I almost cried right there. As I pulled out of their driveway, I passed a flyer for the town's annual Lobster Fest. I hadn't been invited this year. Usually I brought the cornbread. This year there wasn't even a mention. My absence wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. It was a voice, low and urgent, that finally shattered my grief and replaced it with cold, hard resolve. A few mornings later, the wind was blowing from the east, carrying sounds with unusual clarity. I had just come in from the garden when I heard it through the open kitchen window. It was Simone, outside on her phone, pacing along the seawall where she must have thought she had privacy. Her voice was crisp, all business. She was talking to someone about permits, investors, and something called the Serenity Cove Retreat. "The branding is perfect," she said, her voice sharp with excitement. Clara and her husband were amateur conservationists, very respected locally. We'll play that up for grant money. Legacy, empowerment, a woman-founded story. Makes it much more appealing to funders. I stood there, frozen, the dish towel in my hand clenched into a tight ball. She was going to use my life, Robert's life, our shared passion, as a marketing gimmick. "The last parcel is the only hurdle," she continued. "Clara's land. Once that's signed over, we can move forward. It's the final piece of the puzzle." I stepped back from the window and sank into a kitchen chair. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a kind of profound, clarifying rage. She hadn't just underestimated me. She had seen my life's work not as something to be honored, but as something to be leveraged. She forgot I kept every document, every logbook from our coastline surveys, every handwritten note from the school children we used to take on tide pool tours. This land wasn't just property, it was a living classroom, a sanctuary, and she wanted to bulldoze it for profit. That night, I pulled the old file box from the linen closet. Inside were copies of every land agreement and the original deed. Tucked inside was a note from Robert written in his strong, steady hand. "This land is for Clara. Let it stay hers and let it serve." By dawn, I had a plan. Simone had her project. Now, I had mine. The morning after I heard Simone's call, I made another one. Mr. Alistair Finch. He was retired now, but his voice still carried the same calm authority. He remembered me, and when I told him why I was calling, there was a pause, not of surprise, but of a kind of weary knowing. We talked for nearly an hour. He confirmed the original deed was strong, but suggested a more permanent protection. He told me about a community land trust, a legal structure that could ensure the property remained dedicated to a specific purpose in perpetuity. If you create a trust with a board, he explained, you can designate the land for public benefit, for conservation and education. Not only would it be untouchable by developers, but it would serve the very cause you and Robert believed in. Then he said something that landed like a quiet bell ringing inside me. "Clara, your name means something in that town. Don't forget that." After we hung up, I sat with those words. I had simply stepped back. Now it was time to step forward. I called my old friends, Eleanor from the Historical Society, Martha from the Conservation Group, quiet power, real power. By that afternoon, we had agreed to meet, not just for tea, but for strategy. That evening, I drafted a mission statement. I called it the Cove Light Trust, a program dedicated to preserving the local marine ecosystem and providing educational opportunities for the community. The land would be the anchor. I signed nothing for my son, but I was about to give something far better to the town. As the sun set over the cove, I lit a single candle on the windowsill. It wasn't for mourning. It was for marking a beginning. That Sunday morning in church, Reverend Michael spoke about community. He closed his Bible and said, "Forgiveness does not mean surrender. You can love someone and still not hand them the keys to your house, your peace, or your land." It felt like the universe was giving me its blessing. By late afternoon, Eleanor and Martha were at my kitchen table. We worked for hours, sketching out what the Cove Light Trust would become. Workshops for local children, tide pool explorations, a small educational center in the old boathouse. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel outnumbered. I felt rooted. It was a Thursday afternoon when Leo and Simone showed up unannounced. They came in with polished smiles and a leather binder. Simone launched into her smooth presentation about potential investors, tax benefits, and projected returns. Her voice filled the room, but it was hollow. She never used the word family. She never said the word home. Then she reached the end, a page with my initials typed next to a line labeled, "Property Owner Approval." She looked up and smiled as if it were already done. I didn't touch the papers. I simply reached down beside my chair, opened a manila envelope, and took out a single sheet of my own. "This is from my lawyer," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It confirms that this seaside property, its cottage, and the cove now belong to the Cove Light Trust. I am no longer the sole owner, and the foundation has no intention of selling." Simone's face froze. Leo leaned forward, his composure finally cracking. "But why?" he stammered. "Why didn't you talk to us about this first?" I looked directly at my son, and I felt the last bit of the old familiar ache finally dissolve. Because I did, that night at the restaurant, and you both made it clear that what you wanted had nothing to do with me, or with your father's memory. This land was never meant for profit. It was meant to outlive us with dignity. Simone closed her binder with a sharp snap. Her cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment, but from fury. She stood up first. Leo followed, his eyes avoiding mine. They walked out without saying goodbye. I picked up the glossy proposal they had left on the coffee table and slipped it into the fireplace. The flames curled the corners inward like dried leaves. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, I felt warm, not because I had won, but because I had finally stopped waiting for them to understand. I had made peace with being misunderstood. The morning of the foundation launch, the cove was draped in a gentle mist. The event was small, intimate, just a few dozen members of the community, folding chairs set up beneath the old sycamore tree. I stood behind a simple podium and looked out at their faces. I spent a long time waiting for the people closest to me to understand what mattered, I said. But I learned that sometimes you stop waiting, you start building. This land was never meant to be a business deal. It was meant to be a place where something good can grow. Today, we begin the Cove Light Trust. I'm not handing this over to someone else's legacy. I'm keeping it where it belongs, with those of us who still believe in second chances no matter how old we are. The applause rose, soft at first, then louder, settling deep like a warm coat on a cold day. After, we shared clam chowder and cornbread. There was laughter. There were stories. That day wasn't about who wasn't there. It was about who chose to be. And I had finally chosen myself. A month later, the headline in the local paper read, "Coastal Retreat, Project Collapses Amid Funding Loss and Community Backlash." The article detailed how investors had pulled out after community members raised concerns about land ethics and the property's history. One quote read, "I'm glad the land stayed where it belongs." I folded the paper and went inside. There was no rush of victory, just a quiet confirmation. I don't know if I'll ever see Leo again, but I've learned that letting go wasn't losing him. It was finally recognizing who he had always been. The house has grown peaceful again. The silence breathes. The land is no longer something to protect, but something to share. Women and children now gather here, their laughter mixing with the sound of the waves. If you had told me a year ago that I would find my peace not in being remembered by my children, but in being remembered by my community, I wouldn't have believed it. But sometimes peace shows up in unexpected rooms. You are never invisible. You are simply waiting to be seen by the right eyes, starting with your own. If you've ever been overlooked or made to feel small, I hope this story reminds you that it's never too late to reclaim your space. The greatest act of love is choosing yourself with grace and quiet power. Your voice matters. You are not alone.